12, 2018, and I thought I'd have another webinar on boundaries. You can't have too many webinars on boundaries. And really, that's because a lot of the work that I've been thinking about and doing lately has had to do with boundaries. I think it's one of the most challenging concepts. I'm going to talk about why it's challenging as a concept, and then I'm going to talk about some reasons why it's difficult for us emotionally to maintain, to select our boundaries. And like a lot of the work that I do, I'm going to talk tonight about some not necessarily common sense ideas that you hear from pop psychology people often. I'm going to talk about kind of a deeper level of it and talk about it in a little bit of a different way. So I hope that's helpful. The first question is that I ask myself is, why are boundaries so hard for people to explain and to understand? And I think it's because, first of all, they're subjective, right? There's no right boundary for a person to have on any given topic. Everybody gets to have their own boundary, and so you can't really appeal to one person. You could talk about a person who has clear and healthy boundaries in their life, but they might have different boundaries than you, and vice versa. So there's no objective kind of standard to measure ourselves against, right? And so somebody who has good boundaries might have very different boundaries in various areas in their life that you might not have or might not appeal to. So they're very subjective. There's no one right way for us to think about a specific boundary. And they're personal. It's something that is absolutely so subjective. As a therapist, that's why it's important that the work that I do with a client is cooperative, right? It's helping them discover their own truth. And so when somebody comes to me with an opinion about a child boundary, for example, a boundary to have with their child, I'm not going to answer the question directly, not to begin with. I'm going to ask a series of questions about, what are you hoping for? What's your truth? What's your value here? What do you want to accomplish? And start to tease out the thinking errors that go into setting and establishing a boundary. If the person is thinking about it in terms of outcomes, that's one thing that I'm going to challenge principally, because boundaries don't necessarily guarantee that anybody else is going to change. But if that outcome is that you'll have greater clarity, you'll have a greater peace and serenity, then that's something that we can focus and hone in on. So the establishment, the discussions, the process around setting boundaries is something that you do with a therapist. You can't really borrow from them their idea about a particular boundary and apply it, because you then have to live with it. So they're very personal. Shame surrounds them. We don't want to own our own boundaries, right? We don't want to own our own vulnerabilities, our own needs. We don't want to make it about us at all, right? I want to make it about you and your behavior and what you're doing right or wrong in life, the way you're treating me, the way you're acting. Instead of saying, I don't feel comfortable with this, I'm not okay with this, regardless of whether the entire world says that the way that you're treating me is appropriate or not, I'm uncomfortable with this dynamic in the relationship, and so I'm going to set this boundary. And we don't want to do that. We don't have the confidence, the sense of self, really, to do that, right? That's because, and I'm going to talk about this a lot tonight, in our lives growing up, it was more about the right way, the right thing to do, than it was about just who we were and what we felt. And our parents had to be right. And they made us wrong in various examples of behavior. And so we grew up having to justify ourselves, having to be right about the thing, instead of just be us about the thing. So there's no right way. They're personal. Shame surrounds them, right? If I have to own my own need, if I have to own my own want, I'm going to be ashamed of that. Right? I don't want to need anything or anybody. We call that the shame of dependence, right? I don't want to depend or need anything from anybody. You know, we even talk about babies that express very little rage and very little sadness, that are easy to comfort, that have very few needs. We describe those babies as good babies. We use this. This is a part of our culture, right? If I said to you, my brother just has a 3-month-old and it's a really good baby, you would know exactly what I mean. So from birth, we start to define people with fewer needs or needs that are easily met as good. Of course, the implication is to have more needs is bad. And because people, in relationship to children, because we don't want to own our own sense of inadequacy, right? If I'm a father and my child is upset, sad, hurt, frustrated, unhappy, instead of owning how that feels as a father, that I feel inadequate, that I don't feel good as a father, I make the child's needs wrong or bad. I use words like selfish, right? I try to shrink them down to a size that I can manage. I say they're overreacting. They're being too sensitive, right? So we start this process around shame, around our needs from birth, literally. And we learn that when we upset people, when we're too much for them, that we're likely to be judged, rejected, right? Dismissed. And we don't want that. That's the most frightening human interaction, reaction in the world, is to be rejected. So we learn to suppress, to not take care of our needs, to not even have them. So that's where that shame comes from. And we get so lost when the other person is present. So much of the work that I do in couples therapy and in parenting education and therapy and working with kids is helping people understand the effect of the other. You know, when the other walks into the room, do you lose your sense of self? Because you're so conditioned to take their temperature, to respond to their moods, to their reactions, to their feelings and thoughts. I've given this example before, and it's happened to me hundreds, if not thousands of times, where after a discussion with a parent, we've become very clear on an idea, a boundary, something that they want. We flush it out. We might even practice how to talk about it. And then they get on the phone or they have a visit with their child, and immediately they'll say, it was gone. Immediately I was challenged by the internal forces, the feelings that I had when I was in the presence of my child. Maybe the equation changes a few percentage points. Like they brought up something that I hadn't considered, hadn't thought about, or they seem so upset, or whatever the energy is, and then they lose that. You lose your sense of self, right? And so much of the work of enlightenment, the work that we do at Evoke, is about developing a sense of self. That's not really common work out there, even for therapeutic programs and therapists, is this idea of the sense of self, developing a sense of self, not just in our children, which is fundamental, right? That's our fundamental responsibility, is to help a child develop a sense of self. But we don't even honor the parent's journey in the development of self, right? One of my most frustrating experiences, observations around parent education, comments in pop psychology around parenting, the media around parenting, is how little people honor the journey of the parent. Honor the fact that the parent comes with their own wounds, their own compromised self, and that we think we can change that, fix that, by giving them information and by making it right, instead of realizing that really the work of parent education is part education and part skill building, but a whole lot of healing. And we ought to have the same compassion for parents that are struggling that we have for children that may be even struggling at their hands, right? Because parenting wounds affect children, right? Intergenerational transmission of trauma is real. It happens in all families at varying degrees. So learning to define self, learning to, phrases like being grounded, being clear, knowing yourself. All of those speak to this idea of a sense of self, so that when somebody walks in the room, that I'm not quickly lost in that. It's like the boy that I've talked about before, who after weeks of wanting a parent phone call and me being on the fence about whether it was the right time or not, and then he got a really tough, difficult letter from his father with some really profound disclosures, honest and vulnerable disclosures from his father. And I was ready at this point, prior to this letter, for him to have the phone call with his father. And the young man said to me, the 16-year-old young man said to me, I don't think I'm ready to talk to my dad this week. It wasn't out of punishment. He followed it up by saying, I'm afraid if I get on the phone with him, I'll lose my clarity, and I need to sit with this for a couple of days. I mean, that's so profound. That's really why wilderness can be so effective. Because the separation of all of these others, spending some time getting to know, developing a stronger, firmer sense of self, stronger roots, and then reintroducing people back together to practice it. Right? That's really the core work of relationships, of intimacy, is this development of a consistent, stable sense of self. I talked about when the equation changes, right? Because if the equation changes, but the core self features of the self are present and developed, the equation changing doesn't throw us off, right? And by the way, I want to be clear about this. It does with all of us. I'm not speaking from some pedestal on high saying, I've got this figured out. This is my work. This is what I do in therapy every week, going back to my therapist and saying, I had a conversation with my daughter, I had a conversation with my son, I had a conversation with my wife or a client, and I'm lost. And then my therapist offers me the same process that I offer my clients to help me rediscover the self. And they do that in part by first them finding me through a series of questions and answers back and forth. We get outcome focused, right? We ask questions like, what's going to be the best outcome for my son or for my daughter, for my spouse, for my friend, if I say this, if I do this? And the answer is we don't know. One of the biggest mistakes or myths about boundaries is that boundaries are about teaching other people's lessons. Boundaries do teach other people lessons, but that's not the primary function of the boundary. I want to say this as clearly as possible because I'm going to talk about this for a few different slides. The core feature of boundaries is self-care. That's what it's about. It's about me taking care of myself. It's about me saying to others in my life, those that are in my life every day, those that I come across less frequently, and saying, this is what I'm okay with. This is how I want to be treated, need to be treated. And we don't say this out loud, but essentially we say, and if you can't treat me this way, ultimately, right? This isn't the threat every day if somebody snaps at you, but ultimately, if you can't treat me fundamentally in these ways that are core values to me, what you don't get is my presence. You don't get me, because I can't be compromised in that way. And again, it doesn't start that way. It's not every discussion. It's not every small mistake or every small feature of the way somebody talks to us or treats us. But if it's sustained, if it's significant, if it costs us too much, that's what a boundary is. Parents often think about boundaries in terms of what we want others to learn from our boundaries, or how we want others to change. And that's not what it's about. It's not about changing other people. Excuse me. And we also don't want people to challenge us, right? We don't want people. We expect to set a boundary very clearly and to have that be that. That's not the way that it works. Not with your children, not with your spouse, not with your best friend. You set boundaries and you need to go back to it again and again. And it's your job. And yes, if you were surrounded by perfect people, you would set it one time and they would never make a mistake. But that's not the way that people work. So it's incumbent on you to set, to establish, and to maintain boundaries. And nobody else in the world is saddled with the job of taking care of you but you, right? Which means you can ask people for help and get support. But you've got to do that. Nobody's going to come in and rescue you. Or waiting for them to can be a big mistake in this work. Boundaries are, I talk about them using the phrase, this is what I feel comfortable with, all right? They rise out of your truth. And what I mean by that, that sounds like a very therapy-like idea. They are your feelings, your thoughts, your wants, your hopes, what you can tolerate, your needs, right? Those are your truths. I don't like mushrooms. I don't like sweet potatoes, right? I'm not comfortable sneaking into a movie for free. I'm not comfortable treating a child that way. I'm not comfortable with swearing. You get to choose what it is. And then to say to the other person, I'm not necessarily right. I'm not saying you're wrong. You don't have to be any different than you are. But here's what I need to be okay. It is the spouse saying to the alcoholic spouse, you don't have to quit drinking. I want you to, but you don't have to. But I can't have this in my life. Right? It's saying to the child, I might be wrong. I might be overreacting with having you go to evoke, or sending you to aftercare, or cutting you off, or kicking you out of the house, on and on. I might be overreacting. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, this is what I feel comfortable with. Like I said, boundaries are me taking care of me in relationships. And they're not dependent. They don't require necessarily anybody else to change, because if the other person doesn't change, then I can take my space. Resentment and anger in a relationship are often, I find, signs of poor self-care. The book, The Dance of Anger, which I talk about, is one of my favorite books about boundaries, where Dr. Lerner says that anger is only an effective tool if it causes us to be more clear about ourselves, not about other people. So if I'm mad or resentful at the way my wife is acting, or the way that my son is acting, or my daughter is acting, if I think about turning that around and saying, what do I need to do different to take care of me? All right? And can that work? Can I change? Instead of what most of us do most of the time, which is we talk about what the other person is doing wrong, and what they need to do. And we talk about that like that's a boundary. That's not a boundary. That's just judgments and opinions about somebody else. And that's not what this is about. Expecting others to treat you a certain way without requiring it. You know, a boundary is a boundary is a boundary is a boundary. Saying things like, you can't treat me this way, they can't treat me this way, right? This is not okay, this is not fair, you're not being, I wouldn't do this to you. All those kinds of things, trying to get somebody to wake up, to treat us in the way that we require. Instead of saying, you know what, actually, you can keep doing it that way, but I can't be here if you do. And sometimes that's as simple as walking out of the room. That's as simple as not going to the same restaurant or movie. You know, I don't want to be too trivial. But sometimes it can be more significant. Like, this is the stand I'm going to take in our relationship. And these are the boundaries that we're going to set. The reciprocity mistake is this idea that I wouldn't treat you that way. You don't have to have one standard. You can say to somebody, I don't like swearing. And if they say, well, you swear once in a while, you say, well, when I swear, it's okay. But I don't like it when you do. You're allowed to say that. And again, you can say, I might be crazy. But you're allowed to have a double standard. You really are. If the other person doesn't want swearing, they're allowed to say that too. So this idea that, it's this codependent idea that I'm expecting, hoping, wanting you to treat me the way that I treat you, and if you don't, then I'm gonna nag, bully, shame, argue, debate, right? All those things we do in lieu of boundaries. Arguing, debating, nagging, guilting, shaming, um, just being relentlessly um, verbal about getting the other person to change. All of those are excuses for boundaries, not boundaries. Making it about them is a very common idea, like your behavior, that's inappropriate, you're not being kind, you're being unreasonable, you're being selfish, you're being whatever. You're being too rigid, you're being too lackadaisical as a mother, as a father, whatever it is. Instead of saying, you know what? Instead of thinking about this, you're wrong, I'm just going to tell you this is what I want. This is what I need. This is what I'm comfortable with. Taking care of yourself so your kids don't have to and that they know you're okay. You know, if we can do battle with our shame, folks, if we can do battle with the things that get in the way of our boundaries, and we can start to set boundaries, that's really what Al-Anon is about. It's not about having an alcoholic spouse or an alcoholic son or daughter. It's about getting clear with your boundaries. It's about taking care of yourself. And you start to see this in people who are doing their work. You start to see them telling the truth more often, taking care of themselves. You might not agree with everything they're doing, but they're doing it. And there's something about them that's a lot more safe, right? You know that if they compliment you, they're sincere. You know that if they say they want to go out and hang out with you, that they're telling you the truth. It's uncomfortable initially for a lot of us because we're so unfamiliar with people setting healthy boundaries in our lives, telling the truth, showing up honestly, taking care of themselves, that it can be off-putting or even sometimes even feel a little bit hurtful because we're just not used to it. But that's what it really is about. That's what this work is about. That's what your work is about at Evoke and afterwards, is learning to take care of yourself so your child doesn't have to. And when you can take care of yourself, you can be there for your child, right? Instead of requiring them to be there for you. That's not really what being a child is about. And when a parent is good, is improving in their boundaries, guess what happens to a child? They have to consider the other. They actually learn empathy from this, meaning that they don't get everything that they have to learn how to deal with other people. Something my therapist says to me once in a while when I'm expressing some frustration about a family member or a loved one. They say dealing with other people is really hard, isn't it? And it's just a funny reminder to say, yeah, it is. I have to deal with other people's needs, and they don't always line up with mine. So I have to figure out how to take care of myself in that context and honor them at the same time. Again, this phrase, this is what I am comfortable with. I would encourage. It's one of the most, I think, helpful tools when you are parenting, to start to set your boundaries with, this is what I'm comfortable with. And try your best to stay away from language, ideas, concepts that are right and wrong. Try to justify your parenting decision. Tell your child why they should agree with you, why they should like it, why you're making the right decision. Rather say, I don't know. This could be wrong, I don't know. But this is what I'm going to do. This is what I feel comfortable with. It changes everything. It changes you. It changes them. You're modeling wonderful behaviors, and then they have to learn how to deal with you. The human parent that you are. The barriers, like I talked about, shame. Others will push back. We want others to do for us what we need to do for ourselves. It's a very common dynamic in a codependent relationship, right? We want. It took me many years in an unhealthy relationship in my life. Not a marriage or a partner, but another relationship. It took me many years to realize it was my job. Nobody was going to come to my rescue. Nobody who was watching this relationship was going to come and save me. Nobody was going to fight my battle for me. The person that I was trying to get to change through every possible way that I could think of wasn't going to change, and that I would have to take care of myself at some sacrifice. We grew up in a world where it was about right and wrong instead of about people. I had a mother tell me one time about trying to kind of justify her divorce, and I said to her, I don't have an opinion about whether you should be divorced or not. It's not my job, my right. It's not, I don't know your truth. If you think you need to be divorced, then that's your truth. And you don't have to justify that to me, to any therapist, to any of your children. That's not what this is about. There's a concept tonight that I haven't talked about, I don't think, as extensively in other webinars around boundaries. It's this idea of learning how to lose. Learning how to lose is one of the greatest ideas, most amazing ideas in mental health. My therapist was telling me about working with borderline personality disorder clients. And she said that somebody who was training her, she worked at a mental health hospital and there were a lot of them there. She said she learned from a supervisor that somebody told her one time, you can't win, you can only choose how to lose. And borderline is both a specific diagnosis, but it's also a level of functioning. There's borderline level of functioning. And then there's borderline, the diagnostic category of borderline personality disorder. And so many people, when they think in very black and white, very rigid ways, all of us under stress or duress kind of can gravitate toward that end of the functioning level, right? Our culture is very black and white, very borderline. If you're not for me, you're against me. That kind of thinking. If we adopt more often this idea of you don't get to win, you don't get to win with your children. You just get to choose how to lose. And if you get good at losing, really good at losing, you'll become an incredibly powerful parent. Which is, I don't have to be right, I can be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. This is just me. This is just what I think and what I feel and what I need. I say to parents often, you don't get to be right anymore. And that's what I mean by this. And most parents spend a lot of energy, a lot of verbal energy, talking and teaching and reasoning to their children. My wife pointed out that I just did it this week a couple of times, telling my kids how they should feel, right? About a certain rule, a certain boundary, because that I was pretty flexible in other areas. And basically what I'm saying to them is, don't be mad. See, I'm a good dad. Like me, be happy, right? Instead of saying, I might be flubbing it up, I might be messing it up. Learn how to lose. Give up being right. It's the most powerful position that you can take. It's an unassailable position. See, the woman who leaves her alcoholic husband, the Al-Anon woman who leaves her alcoholic husband, it of course can be the other way around, gender speaking, but just using the cliche, the stereotype, the codependent woman who leaves her alcoholic husband, she gives up being right. She stops being held hostage by the idea, by the argument, by the debate that she's doing the wrong thing. Right? Getting in touch with your horrible self, your rotten self. Being okay with, maybe I'm a bad guy, maybe I'm horrible. And again, that's not a position of low self-esteem or self-worth. That is what the enlightened people talk about. That's what the Gandhis and the Mother Teresas and the enlightened souls that have walked on the earth, they talk about their stupidity and idiocy. They're in touch with it. Instead of always trying to defend it and prove that they're worthy or right or good enough, they've become friends with their horrible self. It's been a liberating 15 or 20 years for me to become more and more comfortable with being the bad guy. And by the way, it doesn't lead to me being a worse person. It leads to me being more compassionate, more service-oriented, more kind, more patient, more empathic, more sensitive, more generous, and more loving, right? So making friends with your dark side. Carl Jung said the best way to understand somebody's darkness is to come to terms with your own. Right? That's what psychotherapy can do for you. Long-term psychotherapy. You become comfortable with the parts of yourself that you're afraid are horrible. Those become healed, but you also stop trying to be right in your relationships more and more. Stop trying to be good. You are already good. Imagine, it's one of the questions I often ask a family. If you can imagine asking yourself, what if you knew you were okay? I like the word okay. Let's say the word good. I don't like the word good, actually, even though I wrote it on this slide. If you knew you were okay in a given interaction and somebody was upset with you, frustrated with you, angry with you, whatever it is, how would you respond? And the answer is you would respond empathically, patiently, with understanding, with sensitivity, with gentleness. I use the joke you would say in your head and maybe even say out loud if the mood was right. You haven't even begun to touch on my limitations, my faults. You're just scratching the surface. But what you're really offering the other person is a right for them to feel and think what they're feeling. And the ability, the courage, the confidence to say, I'll try and do better. I'm sorry. That's what it would be like if we knew that we were okay already. We wouldn't need to try to prove it to anybody. We wouldn't need to defend anything. We wouldn't need to be right because we would already know that we're okay. Trying to get from others what your parents should have given you, often from your children. Praise, worth, value, a self, right? Alice Miller talks about this idea that we're often trying to get from our children that which we should have gotten from our parents. This idea about my child used to look up to me. It's not their job to look up to you. It's not their job to be grateful to you. It's not their job to think you're wonderful. They will, and in most cases, but it's not their responsibility for you to feel good about you. That's what you have to do. Most likely in therapy, in a 12-step program, with some good psychoeducation. That's your work. It's not their work. And then when you're doing that work somewhere else, when you're filling up that cup somewhere else, you can be back with your child and say, what can I do to support you? How can I be there for you? Don't justify your boundary or make it about the other person's behavior. It's about just owning your stuff. You can't really choose all of your stuff because some of it was given to you and takes years, maybe a lifetime to work on and to get rid of some of your issues, your faults, your flaws, your needs, your limitations, your neuroses, but owning it. Learning to own it. And not having that ownership come with such a compromise of feeling horrible about yourself, right? Also, what that will do is that will give you much more compassion for other people too. The more you come to terms with, make friends with the dark side of yourself. So the take home, work on finding you. That's your job. Learning about your intentions, asking about what's my intention in saying or doing this thing? Where's this coming from? Oftentimes, I think it could be best worked out with the help of a professional therapist. And by the way, not all therapists can do what I talked about tonight. A lot of them might think they have the right ideas to give to you and think that they can tell you what your truth is instead of just offering you an idea, a perspective, seeing you, finding you, right? That goes back to my blog and my broadcast on what to look for in a therapist. Letting go of outcomes. Why do people from Al-Anon tell the truth more often? Because they're not trying to manage what you think or feel, right? That's why we lie, is to control other people, control what they think and what they feel, how they perceive us, how they judge us, how they value us. But when you stop trying to control other people, you start telling the truth more. You start showing up more honestly, more honest in your relationships. Learning to die over and over again. I debated over this phrasing, this idea in psychotherapy and spiritual growth about learning to die over and over again, learning to rediscover the deeper layers of yourself, making that your project. Don't stop growing. Do not arrive. Do not discover all of the truth. Those are the hardest people to be around, are the ones who've figured it out, know the truth, and they're there to give it to you because they've figured it out. They'll tell you how to raise your son or daughter, right? They come to you and say, you do this, you do that, this is how it'll turn out. This is your mistake. This is what you're doing wrong. This is what you need to do. Instead of saying, I know, this is really hard stuff, isn't it? These little rascals came here to teach us something that we can barely learn. So learning to die over and over again is the process of rediscovering new and deeper truths. Stop being right. It's a barrier to intimacy. It's a barrier to relationship. It's a barrier to a sense of self. It comes to us honestly from a childhood where there was someone was right and somebody was wrong. It's okay to have any boundary as a father, as a mother, but you don't get to be right about it anymore. You just get to be you. And in living that way with your child, exposing your child to that water is one of the greatest gifts, because then they will then realize it's about who they are. And then they'll go out in the world with a greater sense of who they are. And when someone tells them to do something or not do something, to fit in, to please them, they'll say, that's not my truth. Nobody will be able to knock them off of where they stand, because they will have grown up in a family where being a self was the thing, not being right or good. This is the road less traveled. People will not necessarily line up to cheer you on. In fact, much of what we're talking about at Evoke, what I'm talking about tonight, and a lot of the work that I teach, most people will criticize you and think that you've gone crazy. This is not society's mainstream values. This is different. But you came here for something different, right? You came here because it wasn't working, because you were stuck, because the family was stuck, because your child was suffering. So this is something different. I promise you, the solution is not about being a good parent, being told you're a good parent, thought of as a good parent. The solution is in learning to lose and learning that you're a very human parent with your own wounds, your own limitations, your own struggle, and learning to find yourself in all of that. Lastly, is just this idea about honoring your journey. You know, in my work with families over the 23 years that I've been doing this, what I've learned is that every parent is on as wonderful a journey as their child, and to get frustrated, angry, judgmental, short, opinionated, condescending about or toward that parent. I went to a family therapy session tonight myself to work on my boundaries with my 15-year-old. We had a discussion when we came home. I'm working on it too. That's all I can offer, is to be on this journey with you and to honor your journey without judgment. All right, I'm happy to take any live questions. What's the difference between tough love? Is there a difference between tough love and boundaries? The first question comes in. I don't really use the word tough love anymore. I think tough love it's because it's difficult. Because I think it's a way of saying it's okay for your kid to be mad at you and to hate you. So that's how I think it would relate to boundaries. I'm saying it in a little bit of a different way. There's something about tough love that sometimes has felt in the past, and it's not really used in our literature a lot um, anymore. There's sometimes it can become punitive. Sometimes it can be a justification for being cruel. And boundaries are, again, more about how tough it is for me to take care of me, to own my own needs, to do that work. That's tough. So in that way, they would be similar. But tough love can have some of those other elements of it that I just described. And we don't think about boundaries. We don't think about the principal idea of boundaries as changing the other person. We think about them as self-care. And people do learn. Remember, think about this. A father or a mother who goes to Al-Anon and does their work with codependency and comes home, they're more clear, they're more assertive, they're more courageous, they're more honest with their children. And their children learn much, much more from a person focusing on boundaries and self-care than they learn from a parent who thinks that they know the child's truth and thinks that that's their job, is to give that to their child. I set a boundary at Christmas, the next parent says. My son was smoking weed and drinking. I told him he could not stay in my home. He went to his paternal grandparents. 2 days later, he said I hurt him. He has no real home. No other parent would do this. It really touched on my fear of abandonment, etc. However, I was able to say, you have a home. You can stay here. However, you can't stay here if you are using. I'm not comfortable with you using. This is so tough. I left my alcoholic husband, my son's father. In some way, I feel like I'm leaving my son. All that to say, thank you, as always, for this webinar. I have to hear this again and again. I continue to do my work, even recently adding EMDR. Thank you for sharing that. That's again, courageous work. And in the long run, in the long arc of the work, the people that can see us and respond to us will be in our life. That response by your son, that might be a trigger of his own trauma, and it's not true. And that's a good example of how easy it would be in that Christmas example to lose yourself. It'd be so easy to lose yourself because his trauma is being triggered, your trauma is being triggered, your shadow is being pointed out, what you don't want to be is being, all the stuff that you don't want to be is being told. You're being told that's what you are. You don't want to be an unloving, abandoning parent. Everything brings up. And in that cloud of emotional chaos, it's hard to retain a consistent sense of self. And we all need this work consistently, right? I had a professor in college tell me that someday you get to the point where you don't need therapy anymore and you shouldn't live your life in therapy. And I remember thinking, I was in college and I thought, well, that kind of makes sense. And now I think he had no idea what therapy was. He didn't understand that it's like going to the gym, right? It's a constant work. It's my friend who's been sober from drinking. He's not had any alcohol in his body for 25 years, and he goes to a meeting every day to do his work. It's my therapist who's 76 years old, who's been going to therapy for 50 years, right? That's what it is. What do you do when your child comes home from a vogue? Next parent asks, and aftercare, and thinks they should get everything they want because they worked hard over the last year. They're asking for things, yet I still think they need to continue to work. They have not finished the program, and they still need to graduate. So many mixed emotions. They can think anything they want. They can think they're entitled to anything they want. You don't get to, in this way of thinking, you don't get to control that. You just get to say, this is what I'm comfortable giving you, right? You figure out kind of your core truths, your values, your beliefs, your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas, and you say, I might be wrong, and this might be stupid, but here's my idea, here's what I'm willing to give you. And then they say, you're the worst parent in the world, and you say, you have no idea. No idea of my limitations. You haven't even come close to recognizing them. You just give up being right, and you just be you. You do what you're comfortable with. But instead, most of us, and that's this question's so great, most of us would debate and argue and try to find out the right level and try to explain it to him, or at least find a therapist that will justify the position that we want to take so that we're right. Then we can go to our son because we're right and tell him this is the boundary. And we'll probably leak some of that being right stuff out in there instead of saying, I don't know. Here's my limit. Here's my boundary. Here's what I'm willing to give and not willing to give. And I might be wrong. And you can hate me if you want to. Again, you don't need to say all of that literally to them, but that's the way that you approach them in this example. Thank you. Next question. What about when your children set boundaries with you? What if you think the boundary is not healthy? I mean, as a parent, when they're under the age of 18, you have rights, right? My 3-year-old might think that eating Pop-Tarts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is the right thing to do. I'm not comfortable with that. And this is my house, and I get to make the rules. And again, I'm not saying you say all of that out loud, but that's the thinking is you say we're not allowed to have Pop-Tarts in this house. And then they say you're the stupidest father in the world. Other parents let their kids have Pop-Tarts, and you say, I know. I'm crazy that way. I might be too rigid or neurotic. It's the part in the book, my book, where I talk about being an idiot. When you admit you're an idiot to your child, they don't argue with you, but you don't get to be right. Along with setting boundaries, another parent writes, what are some other practices that help develop a stronger sense of self? That's a great question, and I want to share another story about boundaries because your question made me think about it. When I set boundaries with both of my parents, clear boundaries, several years ago, one of my parents rallied and did their work and showed up in a way that they could support me in the way that I felt comfortable. The other one did not. And I do not have a relationship with that one. I'm not angry at that one. I'm not punishing that one. I'm just not comfortable being in a relationship when they show up in a certain way with me. The same thing could be true of my children later on in life, or my spouse, or vice versa. So you're setting boundaries is about taking care of yourself. Other people may or may not respond to it. When I've set clear boundaries, made changes in my life, I have found friends that I did not know that I had that have gravitated toward me and me towards them. And I have lost friends that I thought were friends, but really weren't because they couldn't respect me. So what are the other practices to develop a strong sense of self? I mean, setting boundaries is more like the result than the practice, right? My belief is some sort of education, psychoeducation, webinars, podcasts, books, those can be helpful. I don't think that it can be done at an optimal level without a good long-term therapist. And I really believe this, and it's just been my experience. It takes years and years and years. And there's hope along the way. It's not like you're hopeless for years. You get into the practice of it, right? You get into the practice of what it means to go to therapy. And then before you choose a therapist, read my blog or the podcast or webinar on what to look for in a therapist. Because if a therapist can't see you, if a therapist thinks that they know the truth and you came climbing up to the mountaintop to meet with the guru and find out the truth instead of them finding it with you, discovering it, evoking it, if you will, out of you, because it's in there somewhere. That self is in there. It just got covered up with all the shoulds, with all the ought tos, with all the shame, with all the pressure to conform, to be something else for somebody else, to be accepted, right? The work of enlightenment, they say, is a destructive process that's about unlearning all of that stuff so that you know, and I say it this way, that when you're hungry, you eat. When you're tired, you sleep. When you're happy, you laugh. When you want to go out with friends to dinner, you go out with friends for dinner. When you want to stay in, you stay in. But you have to do battle with your dragons, right? I love the film Finding Joe. You can rent it on Amazon or buy it. Rent it, on iTunes or buy it. I love Finding Joe because it's Joseph Campbell's idea of this idea of finding and fighting our dragons. So self-help, books, education, webinars, podcasts, other books, therapy, 12-step groups can be very helpful. Al-Anon, codependence programs, right? Because it's participation, it's relationship, it's dialoguing with somebody, right? It's hard to do that with books and podcasts alone. Those can be a part of the repertoire, but in my experience, if I were answering this question honestly, I would say go to therapy for at least 10 years. It's hard for some people because they don't experience anything as broken. I guess that's what I believe our children who are struggling and that are out of hope are here to show us. Is there's something that's not working that we need help with. I'm grateful for my children who have struggled. It's not painless. I don't look at it with joy, but I have a fundamental gratitude for what they've required me to look at. I mean, I've had the great pleasure of dealing with all of your children over these more than 2 decades, right? Because I get to deal with children who are suicidal, who are aggressive, who are self-medicating with sex or cutting or self-harm or drugs or alcohol, anxious, depressed, problem relationships, chaotic. I get to deal with them, and they get to teach me. And I have to learn how to be with them in a way that's helpful. Because what they're telling all of us is, this isn't working for me. Something's broken in here. I need help. There's a hurt or a wound, and it needs addressing. And I don't know how to do it. So some form of therapy or 12. I'm preferential to therapy myself, but some people get a lot of this work by doing their own 12-step work. Also, these intensives that we offer, Finding You, we offer the Finding You intensive. That's where this comes from. If you want to do deeper work, it can be a therapy springboard or a therapy accelerator. Another parent asks, can you address dealing with a teen who won't accept responsibility for setting his own boundaries? He spends all of his energy trying to argue that everyone around him controls him. He adopts a victim posture, does not want to take any responsibility for himself, not saying what he wants or needs. You can't argue with him. You just surrender. You just lose. Just lose it. Lose the battle. You know, the best way to help somebody who's stuck like that is to lose. Say, I can't teach you. You can't. Maybe I'm wrong. You're right. I don't know. But when we get invested in him seeing it or coming to the light, he feels that and fights against it instead of saying, okay, go ahead and live this way, think this way, see how it works. And then you set your boundaries in your life, in your family, in your home. But let go and give up and lose is how I would say to do it. And then there's nothing to fight against. You know, it's easy to do with your clients, much, much easier. And I've noticed this when I work with clients, they go at me. They go at me with what I suspect almost always is what worked for them at home. They tell me I'm a bad therapist. They tell me I don't care, that I'm just doing it for the money, that I'm crazy, stupid, whatever. Old-fashioned, neurotic, rigid, ignorant, unskilled. And I don't say this out loud. I say very little. But the thing in my head, the voice in my head just says, okay. I'm okay with that. I'm okay with all of that. And they stop saying it pretty quickly. The bullets that are in the metaphorical guns that our children point back at us were given to them by us, inscribed by us. We tell them what we don't want to be. We tell them what we want to think, what we want them to think. And that's where the power struggle begins. So again, you just let go, surrender, and lose. Let it wash over you, wash past you. Don't get invested in changing his mind. Just set your boundaries. and let him think that you're the worst, stupidest, most unenlightened, ineffective, ignorant parent that ever lived. Just lose in that way. Honestly lose. And he won't do it anymore because it won't work. It will not have the effect that he wants it to have. Next parent asks, how can you deal with a child that argues with the boundaries? What do I say at the moment? I swear they will have a future as a litigator, but it gets frustrating. Here's the boundary, and the kid tries to argue around it. I mean, don't argue back. Don't be right. Be wrong. You know, don't. The argument comes from a culture in a family where it was about who was right and who was wrong. So the slow and gradual shift to the kind of culture that I'm describing in a family where you just get to be dad, you get to be mom. Crazy old, stupid old mom or dad. Rigid, old-fashioned, out of touch, unenlightened, idiotic mom or dad. But you get to be you. And they get to feel what they feel and think what they think. But ultimately, your boundaries are not up for negotiation. Not the core ones. The small fringe ones, maybe so, there's compromise. But not the core ones. But you don't get to be right. And when you change the water to that kind of water, and you all swim in that kind of water, everything changes. And it takes a while to change, but it can. All right, folks. One last question. Parent asks how to hold a boundary with autism spectrum child with OCD when he is so rigid and caught in a loop. I mean, that's just challenging. I think all the similar principles apply. You're just going to be tested much, much, much more. So it's going to require, remember, and this goes for all of you, but especially with the child you described. I'll say this to you, all of you. All children require capacity. That's really what love is. Love is capacity, right? Love is not a feeling. It's not a warmth. It's not affection. It doesn't mean anything if it's those things. People who have feelings of warmth toward people or affection toward people do horrible things to people sometimes. But capacity, right? If that's love, your children require more capacity than average. So you have to go to more places to fill yourself up more often. That's why we provide these webinars, these podcasts, these broadcasts. That's why we have all the parent curriculum. That's why we ask you to go, for example, like this slide says, we ask all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. They're free, right? Just try them. Try 6 different ones. See what they're saying. See what these people are talking about. They'll be talking about different relationships, different examples, different specific situations and circumstances, but they'll be talking about all of this stuff. You can also go to NAMI.org for classes and free resources in your area. All right, folks. All of these broadcasts are available on our podcast app on your iPhone or your iOS device, your Apple device. Use the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs, or if you have an Android device or a computer, download the SoundCloud app or go to soundcloud.com and search Evoke Therapy Program. These are free. You can share them with your family and friends. Anybody can listen to these. You can listen to them while you're at the gym, while you're on the train. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. And then the Alumni Foundation has changed its name to the Evoke Family Foundation. You can find that on Facebook. That's for people that want to help people that can't afford therapy. So if you want to give back, you want to become involved, you know somebody who needs help, go there. The Evoke Therapy blog, it always has new content. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. You can also purchase an audio version of it there, or CD purchase. The next workshop, we want all current families, if possible, if you can do this, we want you to come to the workshop. The next one is March 24th and 25th at Cascades, and then following month it'll be at Entrada. You can ask your therapist if that timing correlates with an appropriate timing for a visit to your child. The next Finding You, if you want to do deeper work, in fact, we just finished Finding You March 7th through 11th. The next Finding You will be April 18th through 22nd. So if you want to do some of this deeper work, we have a wonderful Summit Lodge in Park City, Utah now that we're running these out of. We also do private family intensives if you want to schedule this for your family. We also do, these are not for parents, but some professionals listen to these podcasts also. For professionals in the field, not Evoke parents, we're also now running these personal growth workshops for professionals to help deal with burnout and working with clients that have that have a lot of pain that you're carrying around, and just balancing life and work. So our next one is a women's group on March 18th through 20th, and then a men's on May 6th through 8th. So if you're a professional listening to this and you're interested, contact us. You can also go to our website or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Parent support groups will be in Chicago this week, March 14th, 6:30 to 8:30 at the Renaissance North Shore. I will be in New York City a week from tomorrow night at CUNY in Midtown. Orange County, California on March 25th, Tuesday, March 25th in Newport Beach. Portland on March 31st, and Seattle coming in May 2018. If you want, for a young adult, for some adventure therapy, light therapy, we have Pursuits custom trips for families or young adults. Think therapy, light, sober, fun, reconnections. All right, folks, the next webinar, the next broadcast, Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast will be Thursday, March 15th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. I'll let you know what the topic will be in the next couple of days. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all your questions and participation. And for and on behalf of your children, thanks for showing up. Thanks for being willing to do your work. There's this one idea that I have where when I'm talking to a family who's early on in the intervention process, I say to the parents, just find something to apologize for to your child. I know they're the identified patient and they clearly have a lot of problems. But the best way, the most effective way to encourage them to take down their armor is for you to take off yours. So if you can think about that idea that I've talked about tonight about learning to lose, finding that sense of self strong enough so that you can come in greater contact, make better friends with the dark side of you, the weak side of you, the flawed side of you, just find something to apologize for. That could be some of the most healing work that you do with your child. Have a great week, folks. I'll talk to you on Thursday night. Take care. Bye-bye.